It all started on a quiet evening. Clara, a 35-year-old woman, had been living an ordinary life with her husband David. They had been married for nearly 10 years, but something was not right. Clara had noticed changes in David's behavior. He was distant, spending more time away from home, and often avoiding her questions. Clara's gut told her something was wrong, but she never expected what was coming. One evening, while going through David's phone, Clara uncovered the truth. David had been having an affair with her younger sister, Mia. The betrayal hit Clara like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just any affair, it was with her own blood, her sister. The shock quickly turned into anger, and Clara's world began to crumble. In the days that followed, Clara's mind was in turmoil. She couldn't eat, sleep, or think straight. Every time she saw David, the image of him and Mia together haunted her. The tension in the house became unbearable, and one fateful night, it all came to a deadly end. David lay dead in their living room, and Clara stood over him with the weapon still in her hand. She had killed him in cold blood. But was it truly just anger that led to this, or was there more behind Clara's actions? Officer Bradley was called to the scene to investigate, and what he would uncover was far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Keep watching as we take you through this story of betrayal, murder, and the shocking truth behind Clara's deadly decision. This is a crime that shook not just one family but left a lasting impact on everyone involved. Clara had always considered herself a lucky woman. At 35, she was married to David, a man she had loved for nearly a decade. They lived in a peaceful neighborhood, surrounded by friends and family. To the outside world, their marriage seemed perfect. But things began to change slowly, in ways that Clara couldn't understand at first. David, now 40, had become distant. He spent more time at work, came home late, and often avoided Clara's questions. It felt like there was a wall between them, one she couldn't break through, no matter how hard she tried. At first, Clara brushed it off. She told herself that David was just busy with work, stressed about projects, or perhaps just tired. But deep down, something felt wrong. She started noticing small things that didn't add up. David's phone was always with him, and he became secretive about his messages. He would step out of the room to take calls, something he had never done before. Clara's intuition told her something was off, but she had no proof, and confronting David seemed pointless without evidence. Then, one night, Clara's world collapsed. It was late and David was in the shower. His phone, usually guarded so carefully, buzzed on the nightstand. Clara hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the phone and saw a message from someone named Mia. The words on the screen made her heart stop. "I miss you. When can I see you again?" Mia was Clara's younger sister. She was 32, fun-loving, and always the center of attention at family gatherings. Clara's hands shook as she read the message. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the pieces were falling into place. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, David's sudden distance, it all pointed to one conclusion. Her husband was having an affair with her own sister. The discovery sent Clara into a spiral of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. How could this happen? How could David betray her like this? And how could Mia, her own flesh and blood, do this to her? Clara felt trapped, suffocating under the weight of the truth she had uncovered. But she kept quiet, unwilling to confront them, until she knew more. Over the next few days, Clara tried to act normal, though every moment around David felt like a lie. She started to watch his every move, noticing every time he slipped away to check his phone or made excuses to leave the house. Her mind was consumed by thoughts of their betrayal. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat, and the tension inside her grew unbearable. Then came the breaking point. It was a Saturday evening, and David had once again made an excuse to leave the house. Clara followed him, her heart pounding in her chest, as she watched him drive to a small hotel on the edge of town. She parked far enough away not to be seen and waited, her stomach in knots. Half an hour later, Mia arrived. Clara's worst fears were confirmed as she saw her husband embrace her sister before they disappeared into the hotel together. Clara's mind went blank. All the emotions she had been holding in the anger, the betrayal, the hurt came rushing to the surface. She sat in her car for what felt like hours, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her thoughts racing. The life she had known was gone, shattered by the people she trusted the most. That night, Clara couldn't bear to be in the same house as David. She stayed in a hotel herself, unable to face him. But the next morning, she returned home, her emotions still raw, her mind still spinning. David acted as if nothing had happened, as if everything was normal. But Clara knew the truth, and she couldn't keep it inside any longer. Over the next week, the tension between them grew unbearable. Clara's thoughts were consumed by revenge, by the need to make David and Mia pay for what they had done. She thought of every possible way to confront them, to expose their lies, but nothing seemed enough. She couldn't just let them get away with it, but she didn't know what to do. Then, one fateful night, everything came to a head. David had been acting more secretive than usual, and Clara's patience was gone. She confronted him in the living room, her voice shaking with anger. David, caught off guard, tried to deny it at first, but the truth was already out. Clara's words were sharp, each one cutting deeper as she told him she knew about the affair, that she had seen him with Mia. David's face went pale, his lies crumbling in front of him. But instead of apologizing, he turned angry, accusing Clara of spying on him, of being paranoid. The argument escalated quickly, emotions running high, and before Clara knew it, the rage inside her exploded. In a moment of blind fury, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase from the coffee table, and struck David across the head. David collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around him. Clara stood frozen, her mind unable to process what had just happened. In a matter of seconds, her life had changed forever. The moment after Clara struck David, time seemed to stop. The sound of the vase hitting his head echoed in her ears as she stared down at him, lying motionless on the floor. Blood was pooling rapidly around his head, and his body didn't move. Clara stood frozen, her hands shaking, unable to process what had just happened. The quiet house was now filled with the heavy silence of the aftermath. Clara's first instinct was panic. She knelt beside David, calling his name, hoping somehow that he was still alive, but deep down, she knew it was too late. His body was still, his face drained of color. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, and her mind raced. She had killed her husband. The man she had spent 10 years with, the man she once loved, now lay dead at her feet. The house was empty, and it felt like Clara was alone in the world. No one knew what had just happened. For a moment, she considered calling the police, confessing to everything. But then her thoughts turned to Mia. The anger she felt toward her sister returned, stronger than before. How could she explain this to anyone? She would be seen as a murderer, and Mia would get away with everything. The betrayal, the lies, it all fueled Clara's growing desperation. As her panic turned to fear, Clara realized she needed to do something fast. Her mind raced with possibilities. She couldn't let anyone find out about the affair. If the police knew the whole story, they might uncover the reason behind the murder. Clara couldn't bear the thought of the shame and the questions that would come if everyone knew the truth. Looking around the room, Clara felt trapped. The evidence was everywhere. The shattered vase, the blood on the floor, and David's lifeless body. She had to clean up, but she had no idea where to start. Grabbing a towel from the kitchen, she tried to wipe the blood, but it only spread, making the scene even worse. She was shaking too much to focus, and her hands were now covered in blood. Then came the knock on the door. Clara's heart stopped. Who could it be at this hour? She wiped her hands quickly, trying to hide the panic that was rising in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time. Clara looked at the door, unsure of what to do. Should she answer it? Should she pretend she wasn't home? But what if they knew she was inside? Taking a deep breath, Clara moved toward the door. Her body felt like it was moving on autopilot as she opened it slightly, just enough to peek outside. It was a neighbor, a concerned look on their face. They mentioned hearing shouting earlier and came by to check if everything was all right. Clara forced a smile, her voice shaking as she assured them everything was fine. She thanked them for checking but said she was just about to go to bed. As the neighbor left, Clara shut the door, her back pressed against it as she slid to the floor. She had barely managed to hold it together. Her mind was racing. What now? What if someone else came by? What if the neighbor had noticed something strange? The panic was overwhelming, and Clara felt like she was losing control. She needed to think, to plan. Wiping the blood from her hands, Clara sat in silence for a moment, her thoughts racing. She knew she couldn't hide David's body forever. Sooner or later, someone would come looking for him. Mia, the police, his colleagues at work, someone would ask questions. She had to act fast, but her mind was too clouded with fear to make sense of anything. Clara decided to wait until the morning. She couldn't think clearly in the dark, with David's body lying in front of her. She would need to get rid of the body, clean up the house, and figure out what story to tell. It seemed impossible, but she had no choice. There was no turning back now. The next morning, Clara woke with a jolt. For a brief moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare, but the sight of David's lifeless body in the living room brought the cold reality crashing down again. She knew what she had to do. She needed to get rid of David's body before anyone else found out. Clara dragged his body to the garage, her muscles aching with every step. She wrapped him in a large sheet and pushed him into the trunk of the car. Her mind was blank as she worked, too consumed by the horror of what she was doing to think of anything else. She drove for miles, looking for a place to dump the body. She ended up in a wooded area on the outskirts of town, a place they had visited before on a hike. It was remote, quiet, no one would find him there, she thought. Clara dug a shallow grave, her hands blistered and raw from the effort. She placed David's body in the hole and covered it with dirt, her heart pounding the entire time. It felt like she was burying more than just his body. She was burying the life they had, the years of marriage, the betrayal. When she finished, Clara stood there for a long time, staring at the ground, wondering how it had all come to this. Back at home, Clara scrubbed the house clean, erasing every trace of what had happened. The blood, the broken vase, any sign that David had ever been there. She worked until her body gave out, exhausted but determined to finish. The house now looked normal, but Clara knew that nothing was normal anymore. As she collapsed into bed that night, her mind raced with thoughts of what she had done. She had crossed a line, one she could never come back from. But for now, the evidence was hidden, and no one knew the truth. The question was, how long could she keep it that way? The investigation was only beginning, and Clara's nightmare was far from over. Clara thought she had everything under control. The body was hidden, the house cleaned, and no one had seen anything. She believed she could carry on with life as though nothing had happened. But the reality was far different. Within days, questions began to arise. David's colleagues noticed his sudden disappearance when he failed to show up at work. They attempted to reach him, but all calls went unanswered. At first, they assumed he had taken an unannounced leave, but as days passed without a word, concern spread. Mia, unaware of what had happened, began to worry as well. She hadn't heard from David, and the silence troubled her. She contacted Clara, asking if she had seen him. Clara, trying to keep calm, lied, telling Mia that David had left on a business trip, though she was unsure of the exact location. Mia's suspicions didn't ease, but she accepted the explanation for the moment. As more people questioned David's absence, the situation became tense. Clara's nerves were on edge, knowing it was only a matter of time before someone would start digging deeper. The turning point came when David's boss reported his absence to the police, citing concern that it was unlike David to vanish without a trace. Officer Bradley, a seasoned detective, was assigned to the case. He had handled missing persons cases before, and something about this one seemed strange from the start. A man like David, with a stable job and no history of running off, wasn't someone who would simply disappear. His instincts told him there was more to the story. The investigation began with standard procedures. Officer Bradley and his team interviewed David's co-workers and friends. They asked Mia if she had any idea where David could be. Mia repeated Clara's story about the business trip, but Officer Bradley wasn't convinced. He decided to visit Clara in person to get a clearer picture. When Bradley arrived at Clara's house, she tried her best to appear calm and collected. She told him the same story: David had left on a work trip and hadn't been in contact since. But Bradley could sense something off. Clara's behavior seemed rehearsed, and her answers were too precise. He noted that she was avoiding eye contact, fidgeting as she spoke. Though nothing in her words directly contradicted her story, Bradley's experience told him there was more she wasn't saying. After the initial interview, Officer Bradley returned to the station and began digging into David's life. He reviewed phone records, work history, and any potential leads. It didn't take long to discover that David hadn't been on any recent work trips. His boss confirmed that there had been no assignments that required travel. This revelation deepened Bradley's suspicion. Bradley decided to question Clara again, this time pressing her on the details. He asked about David's behavior leading up to his disappearance, and Clara's responses became more hesitant. She mentioned that they had been having marital issues, something she hadn't revealed before. Bradley noted the change and continued to push, but Clara stuck to her story. Mia's role in the investigation also started to shift. She was growing increasingly concerned, not only about David's disappearance but about Clara's unusual behavior. Mia hadn't seen her sister act this way before, and as the days passed, she began to wonder if something more sinister was at play. She went to the police to share her concerns, and this new development caught Officer Bradley's attention. Bradley decided to look deeper into Clara's background and their marriage. He interviewed neighbors and friends, piecing together a picture of the relationship. Several neighbors reported hearing loud arguments from the house on multiple occasions, though no one had ever called the police. One neighbor, who had been reluctant to speak up earlier, mentioned hearing shouting the night before David disappeared. This raised a red flag for Bradley. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, though much of it remained unclear. Bradley felt certain that David's disappearance was connected to something happening inside their home, and Clara seemed to be hiding key information. The next step was to search the house. When officers arrived with a search warrant, Clara's panic began to show. She had tried so hard to keep everything together, but now it was unraveling faster than she could control. The police went through the house room by room, looking for anything that might provide a clue. They found nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of struggle, no blood, and no clear evidence of foul play. Clara had cleaned too thoroughly. But then, in the garage, one of the officers noticed a faint trail of dirt near the door to the backyard. It wasn't much, but it caught his attention. Following the trail, the officers discovered some disturbed soil in the far corner of the backyard, just beyond the edge of the property line. They began to dig, and it didn't take long before they uncovered something that confirmed their worst fears: David's body, wrapped in the sheet Clara had used. With this discovery, Clara's carefully constructed story collapsed. The evidence was undeniable. Officer Bradley confronted Clara once again, this time with the knowledge that she had lied about everything. Her guilt was written all over her face, and the pressure of keeping the secret finally became too much. She was arrested on the spot, her life now in complete ruin. As Clara sat in the back of the police car, she realized that her attempts to cover up the crime had only made things worse. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The investigation into David's murder had just reached its peak, but the consequences for Clara were only beginning. Clara's arrest marked the beginning of a new phase in the nightmare she had created. The once quiet life she shared with David had now become a public spectacle, with the media capturing every moment. The trial was set, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, onlookers, and those who had known David and Clara. This case wasn't just about a murder, it was about the shocking betrayal, the lies, and the consequences that followed. People wanted to know why Clara did what she did and how it all unraveled so quickly. Clara sat in silence as her defense team prepared their case. Her lawyer aimed to paint her as a woman pushed to the brink, dealing with the betrayal of her husband and sister. They hoped to convince the jury that Clara's actions were a result of emotional turmoil and years of feeling trapped in an unhappy marriage. On the other side, the prosecution was determined to prove that this was cold-blooded murder, planned and executed with a clear mind. They argued that Clara's actions were not the result of sudden anger, but rather premeditated violence. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their version of events. They started by recounting the discovery of David's body, buried in a shallow grave just outside town. They highlighted how Clara had lied to everyone, from her family to the police, to cover up the crime. The evidence, they said, spoke for itself. Clara had carefully cleaned the house and hidden the body, hoping no one would notice David's absence until it was too late. Officer Bradley was called to the stand, recounting his investigation and how he had immediately suspected something was wrong during his first interview with Clara. He described her nervous behavior and the inconsistencies in her story. Bradley's detailed testimony painted a picture of a woman who was hiding more than just her emotions. He spoke about the discovery of the disturbed soil in the backyard and how it led to the grim finding of David's body. The prosecution used this evidence to argue that Clara had not acted in the heat of the moment, but had made calculated decisions to dispose of her husband's body and cover her tracks. Next, Mia was brought to the stand. Her role in the affair had become a key part of the case, as the prosecution believed it was the catalyst for Clara's violent actions. Mia admitted to the affair, her voice shaking as she recounted how she and David had been secretly seeing each other for months. The courtroom was silent as Mia spoke, her shame and guilt clear for everyone to see. She described how Clara had always seemed distant in her marriage, and how she never imagined things would end like this. Mia's testimony was crucial, as it confirmed the motive behind the murder, but it also added a layer of complexity to the case. The defense, in turn, focused on Clara's mental state. They called witnesses who had known the couple for years, painting a picture of a woman who had suffered silently through years of emotional neglect. They described how David had been controlling, how his affair with Mia was the final blow to a fragile marriage. Clara's lawyer argued that her actions were the result of a mental break, brought on by years of emotional abuse and betrayal. They claimed that while Clara had made terrible choices, she was not a cold-blooded killer. Clara herself was called to the stand, a move that her defense team had debated. She appeared calm but emotionally drained. As she spoke, she recounted the events of that night in her own words. Clara described how she had confronted David after discovering the affair, how the argument had escalated, and how, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, she had struck him. Her words were measured, as though she had replayed the events in her mind 1,000 times. She spoke of the shock that followed, how she had panicked and made the decision to hide his body, hoping she could somehow escape the consequences of her actions. The prosecution attacked Clara's testimony, pointing out the careful steps she had taken after the murder. They argued that Clara's actions were not those of someone in shock, but someone who knew exactly what she was doing. They questioned her about the days following David's death, pressing her on why she hadn't confessed earlier. Clara struggled to answer, her voice faltering as she explained that fear had driven her to make terrible decisions. The trial continued for days, with both sides presenting their arguments in full force. The jury listened closely, torn between the emotional weight of Clara's story and the cold facts laid out by the prosecution. The defense tried to humanize Clara, showing her as a victim of circumstance, while the prosecution maintained that she had acted with intent and purpose. As the closing arguments were made, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution reminded the jury of the evidence: David's body, the lies Clara had told, and the careful cleanup of the crime scene. They asked the jury to focus on the facts, not the emotions, and to hold Clara accountable for her actions. The defense, on the other hand, asked the jury to consider the context of Clara's life, the betrayal, the emotional pain, and the years of feeling trapped in a loveless marriage. They pleaded for mercy, arguing that Clara's actions, while wrong, were the result of a breaking point. When the jury was finally sent to deliberate, no one knew which way the decision would go. The evidence was clear, but so were the emotions involved. The trial had revealed a story of betrayal, pain, and murder, but it had also shown the human side of Clara's actions. As the hours passed, the courtroom waited in silence, each person wondering what the outcome would be. The final verdict was yet to come, but the consequences of Clara's actions had already begun to unfold. Lives had been destroyed, and no matter the decision, the impact of that night would be felt for years to come. As the jury returned to the courtroom, the weight of the entire trial settled on everyone's shoulders. The tension was thick, with both the prosecution and defense waiting for the final decision that would determine Clara's fate. The room was silent, except for the soft shuffling of papers, as the jury foreman stood to announce the verdict. Clara, sitting motionless, stared ahead, knowing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The jury had deliberated for hours, carefully weighing all the evidence presented during the trial. Clara's confession, Mia's testimony about the affair, Officer Bradley's investigation, and the discovery of David's body had all played a crucial role in shaping their decision. But this was more than just about the facts. It was also about understanding why Clara had done what she did, and whether her actions were driven by pure malice or a breakdown caused by years of betrayal. The foreman delivered the verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom buzzed as the words sank in. Clara had not been convicted of premeditated, first-degree murder, as the prosecution had pushed for. The jury believed that while Clara had killed David, it wasn't a pre-planned act of violence. They had taken into account the emotional turmoil Clara had endured, but the fact remained she had taken a life. Clara sat quietly as the words washed over her. There was no immediate reaction. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and though her fate had been sealed, she seemed numb to everything around her. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, but there was little comfort in the gesture. Clara knew that no matter what the jury had decided, her life as she had known it was over. The weight of what she had done would stay with her forever. As the sentencing phase began, the prosecution argued for a harsh sentence. They reminded the court of the effort Clara had made to cover up the crime, cleaning the house, hiding the body, and lying to everyone. They emphasized the cold, methodical steps she had taken after David's death, showing no immediate signs of remorse. The fact that it took days before Clara's story started to unravel only made her actions seem more deliberate. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for leniency. They reiterated that Clara was a woman who had been pushed to the brink by a combination of factors: of failing marriage, betrayal by her husband and sister, and emotional strain. Her lawyer argued that Clara's mental state at the time of the murder was fragile, and that she hadn't acted out of calculated malice, but rather desperation and pain. They asked the court to consider a reduced sentence, acknowledging the crime but also recognizing the context that led to it. The judge listened carefully to both sides. The crime was brutal, and David's death had left a permanent scar on those who knew him, especially Mia, who now had to live with the guilt of her role in the events that had unfolded. But the judge also took into account the emotional distress that had contributed to Clara's actions. In the end, the court handed Clara a sentence of 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. It was a long sentence, but one that reflected both the severity of the crime and the understanding of Clara's fragile state of mind. As Clara was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom remained quiet. The trial had brought closure to David's death, but it left a trail of broken lives behind. Mia, still grappling with her involvement in the affair, sat in silence, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't just lost her lover, she had lost her sister too. The affair, which had begun in secret, had ended in tragedy, and the consequences were far-reaching. Mia's guilt would follow her for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the part she had played in the destruction of their family. David's family, who had attended every day of the trial, also left the courtroom in silence. They had hoped for justice, but there was no victory in this. No sentence could bring David back or erase the pain of what had happened. The family's grief was compounded by the public nature of the trial, as intimate details of David's life had been laid bare for all to see. For Clara, the road ahead was long. Prison would become her new reality, a place where she would have endless hours to reflect on the choices she had made. She had acted out of anger and pain, but the result was irreversible. The life she had shared with David, the good memories they once had, were now tainted by his violent death. Clara's days would be filled with the knowledge that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. In the end, this was not just a story of murder, it was a story of broken trust, betrayal, and the ripple effect of one violent act. Clara, David, and Mia had all played their parts in a tragic series of events that had destroyed everything around them. The trial might have ended, but the consequences of that night would linger in the lives of everyone involved. As the final chapter closed, it became clear that the real punishment wasn't just the years Clara would serve behind bars. It was the realization that her actions had shattered not only her life but the lives of everyone around her. The pain, regret, and loss would remain long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines faded.